Chris, thank you for joining us. It's highly appreciated. I know it's early where you're based. If you could give our listeners a quick introduction into what you've done and what you're working on currently.
Sure. Hi, I'm Chris Kohler, currently editorial director at Digital Eclipse, which is a game development studio out here in Emeryville, California, just across the Bay Bridge from San Francisco, where I was racing across the Bay Bridge this morning to be able to get here on time for this podcast. And we are owned, by the way, we are an Atari studio, so we're part of Atari, so I work for Atari, which is not, I think when I was a kid, I was like, I'm going to work for Nintendo, and now I work for Atari, so I should have just been...
Don't tell them
I should have just been... Exactly, right? As editorial director at Digital Eclipse, I touch every project, within the studio to some extent, but the sort of the vast majority of the work that I do is on the projects that are led, by us on the editorial team, and those would be things like Atari 50, the anniversary celebration, Ninja Turtles, Cowabunga Collection, the making of Karateka, Lamasoft, the Jeff Minter story, the interactive documentary, that we've been working on, and sort of the basic idea behind that is, rather than do, a retro collection where it's this sort of typical thing where, here's some old games, play them, make your own fun, figure it out, and maybe here's some bonus materials. It's more like, we are going to tell you a story. We are going to tell you a story about a time, about people, about a certain place, and about certain things that happened in the history of video games, and we are going to use documentary film, we're going to use archival materials, we're going to use playable games, and we're going to put those all together for you, in chronological order, so that we can, when you're done, you haven't just sort of like bought a disc full of some old video games, you've been treated to a whole story about something cool that happened in video game history, and where and when it happened, and then the idea being that when you look at these games, you're not just seeing a ROM that somebody downloaded off the internet. You're understanding that this is a work of art made by a certain person at a certain time, and hopefully you'll understand why they made it, and you'll have a greater appreciation for it, in the end.
So, in essentially, you're making, you're kind of taking all the hard work out of learning, which is great, and you're just giving like this, you're giving people the whole package that where they're learning without realizing, and when they get to the end, they're thinking, oh wow, I actually know so much more than I did before, and I've done. It's learning in disguise, not robots in disguise, learning in disguise. I love, like you're creating this whole package with someone to just go in and say like, yeah, we're experiencing so many things in one unique package, and coming out the end of it smarter, had a great time, can tell people cool things at parties. Like it's perfect.
Exactly. We're bringing back edutainment. We're really doing it this time.
Edutainment. I like that word. Talk to me how you got into this role. Were you much of a gamer when you were younger? Were you an Atari fan, or were you a Nintendo fan? Talk to me about your history.
Sure. Yeah. I think one of my earliest memories is like of a video game, but it's being at my dad's workplace probably in like 1982 or 1983. I mean, I must have been 2 or 3 years old, sitting up on a stool at a workbench, looking at Superman for the Atari 2600 and probably trying and failing to play it. And the cool thing was that it was on a pirated EEPROM chip, because my dad had figured out how to like copy Atari 2600 games using early 1980s parts and things like that he'd pick up at Radio Shack or order from catalogs or whatever he was doing. Not even at that point, because this is 1983. All these games are $1. You know what I mean? And sitting in bargain bins because it's like peak Crash.
Yeah.
But just to figure out how to do it. And so I was very lucky that we always had in the, again, this is very rare in growing up in the 80s, but like we always had technology in the house. Maybe it wasn't the latest and greatest technology, because it's not like we had tons of money or anything like that, but we always had, there was always a computer in the house, from my earliest memories. He had a TRS-80, And so by the time, and so we played a lot of games on our Atari 800, And by the time that the NES came out, my parents, again, like, it's not like they had an extra $100, laying around to just go grab an NES, but they understood that this was really special, that this was really something cool and important. And so we got one around 1988 or so, and like all kids kind of have this story of when did I get my Nintendo in the 80s, but I got super into it, like other kids were like, yeah, I play Nintendo. I was just like, I was so down the rabbit hole of the culture, because not subscribing to Nintendo Power magazine, but like reading all of the strategy guide books that I could. I mean, I'd sit there and read those how to win at Nintendo books that had no pictures. They were those paperback books on the revolving racks in the supermarket, and they had no pictures in them, and it was just prose about how to, strategies for like early levels of Nintendo games. And I'd sit there and I'd read these books, and sometimes I had never seen the game. Like, my idea of what Bomberman was completely different from what actual Bomberman was, because I'm literally just reading this description of it. So I'm so deep down this hole of like, watching the Super Mario Brothers Super Show and all this kind of stuff, and realize that writing about video games could be a job, because I messed around with ZZT, which was the first game that Tim Sweeney did for when it was when he was calling his company Epic Mega Games, like as a joke, because it was one guy in his parents' house in Delaware, and he's like, oh, it'd be funny if I call myself Epic Mega Games, and so he does this game called ZZT, and you could make your own games, and I started making my own games in ZZT, and realizing that this was like too hard, that it wasn't giving me the instant gratification that I wanted, and I thought, but if I'm playing these games, then I can write about them. And so I learned about fanzines, because again, before the internet, if you were a fan, you wanted to write your thoughts, opinions about video games, you would literally get some desktop publishing software, and you'd write your thoughts and opinions, and you'd lay it all out in a magazine type thing, print it on your ribbon printer, like not even an inkjet printer, like literally ribbons of ink, and print it out, walk it down to Staples and photocopy it, and then try to find some people to mail it to. And all our addresses were printed in video game magazines, because we'd say, oh, we're making this fanzine,
Incredible.
Write to me, send me $1, I'll send you a copy. So now I'm sending out like dozens of fanzines all over the place, and I'm sending them to the magazine editors. And so when I'm 16, a magazine editor is like, yeah, this is a cool fanzine. Do you want to write for us? Like, we're looking for, people to write about video games. So in high school, I start writing about games. Blah, blah, blah,
Was
blah,
that
blah.
more reviews or guides?
More reviews. Reviews. Because then as now, when you're an editor at a publication, it was the same thing being an editor at a magazine in the 90s. You don't have a lot of time on your hands, and you certainly don't have a lot of time on your hands to play a 60-hour Japanese role-playing game and write a review of it and get it into the magazine. So you're turning to freelancers who, and again, I'm 16, literally, I mean, I was doing reviews. I always got paid. I wasn't getting paid in video games, but actually I was doing stuff for, it was Viz Media, which had their anime magazine, On America, which I don't think they do anymore, and then, of course, they, for a very brief period of time, had a magazine about Japanese video games, and I was doing work for On America and the website and stuff like that, and initially, I started doing work for the website, and they're like, okay, we can pay you $15 for this review of this game, which is like, so, I mean, that was kind of how much money there was to, like, put content on the internet at this point, because there was no revenue from a website, because Wired.com, which I would eventually end up running the video games vertical of for over 10 years. Wired invented the banner ad before I got there, but prior to this, there wasn't any structure for like advertising or selling advertising or whatever you're doing on the internet. The internet was like, people were just sort of playing around in there, like experimenting. So there was no money to pay somebody to write a review, and so they were like, we can pay you $15 for this internet content, or 2 VHS tapes of anime.
Oh, right.
And I was no fool. I took the VHS tapes of anime because those things sold for like $50. This is, remember, again, if you wanted to watch anime, you had to go to the store and you had to buy a VHS tape with 2 episodes of Ranma 1/2, okay? And it cost $50 for that VHS tape. And that was what we did. That was how much money. There were bumper stickers that said, like, anime, crack is cheaper. Like, that's how much money people had to spend on these things. So if you were coming to me saying, I'm going to give you $100 worth of anime tape, yeah, sure, that's worth my time. I was going to play this game anyway. I'm a student.
Yeah.
So it's just that wonderful time where my living expenses are taken care of. I'm a high school or college student. I have nothing but time on my hands, and the ability to say, and then also, and additionally, then I discover you can get free games because you get a couple of clips in the magazine. Then I got very entrepreneurial about it, right? I got very professional about it because I would make photocopies of the work that I had in the print magazines and, put together little packets and send that out to Nintendo, Sony, Capcom, Konami, send it out to the PR people. And again, at this point, they're not getting emails from people. So if a package of a journalist's, clips shows up in the mail, they're not really getting a whole lot of people that are doing that at this time or doing outreach about it. So okay, great. And so the next thing you know, video games, start coming in the mail, from all of these people. Because it's like, oh, fantastic. Yeah, we'll send you a review copy if you're going to put it in. So, that's another kind of like angle to the whole thing. Because now I'm not going out to Electronics Boutique and spending $50, every time I want to get a new video game from one of these. So so it all kind of works out. So, and that's like high school, college. So, so kind of, skipping over a few things basically because I don't really know how much time you have for all of this.
Oh man, keep going.
I end up as I say, we started. I was freelancing a lot for Wired, and it was at the time of the blog explosion. It was Kotaku had started, Gawker had started, with blogs. Joystick, had started up. Destructoid had started up, and Wired again was running the Wired.com website, and they had brought over, at one point they brought over Joel Johnson, who had been at Gawker, and essentially the website was the way the Wired website was you had a group of writers submitting stories, and then every day at like 2 a.m. Eastern, basically, the website would refresh with like 10 more stories. And then those were the stories for that day, And then they kind of realized, like, oh, well, what if we, have all these verticals, hire a person, and now we're just going to pay a person a certain amount of money a month to just fill this with content because, all the stories are being done in the classic magazine kind of style of like, there's a draft and they're going to an editor and the editor is editing, it's going back and forth and all this kind of stuff, and it's this polished story kind of goes up, and there's this realization that you don't actually have to do that on the web. Now, this may have led us, as a society into some serious trouble. But at the time, everybody kind of realizes, like, why don't you just pay somebody and just put them in front of a content management system and just be like, type whatever you want in here and just start publishing it, to the internet. But you've got to get somebody reliable. And so I was living in San Francisco. I mean, I had relationships with the editorial team at Wired.com already. They started a couple of blogs. One of them was not video games. And I think about a month into that, I was just like, hey, let's, have me do video games. And I think it was like the editor-in-chief was like, okay, every day send me an email with like, the 3 things that you would, write a blog about that day and kind of summarize it. I'm like, okay. So it's like Monday, I send him an email, no response. Tuesday, I send him an email, no response. Wednesday, I send him an email. He's like, okay, you're going to do a video game blog. So I'm like, great.
Persistence
and then I did that for 11 years. And I mean, we hired all kinds of people came through it. Jason Schreier, who is at Bloomberg now. I mean, he, originally, I mean, he was one of the people who applied what I needed a second, when I was hiring essentially a second freelancer to come in on the blog with me. All kinds of great people had worked on that, and it's wound down now, unfortunately, and they don't do things under the Game Life banner anymore, which is sad. But so anyway, in 2020, just as the pandemic was starting, I kind of looked at the landscape of the video games media in general, but specifically sort of the games media, this place where I had made my career for almost 25 years at this point, because I had started in 1996. I mean, I've got a framed check on my wall from 1996, and so I was still in high school, but somebody was paying me money to write about video games, and so I'm like, starting the career there and going up to 2020, it's almost 25 years, and I was looking at the landscape of the media thinking there's kind of nowhere else for me to go at this point. In fact, the number of potential places that I could go are getting narrowed down significantly. Meanwhile, I had been talking, with my friends at Digital Eclipse for, quite a while about what could potentially, how could I fit in here? And so it all kind of, there was an opening, there was a possibility, and I'm like, this is the time, to make the jump over, and it's started working here on all of the because Frank Cifaldi, who now runs the Video Game History Foundation, had begun a lot of the work that I'm doing at Digital Eclipse, in terms of the things like the Mega Man Legacy Collection and the Street Fighter collection and the stuff that kind of happened before I was here. But he was gone. He was fully Video Game History Foundation, so it's like somebody needed to come in and do the museums, for these collections, and that really required a journalist to come in, because you needed to have all those skills of researching and talking to people and really going out there and finding all this messy history and figuring out what's true and what's not. How do you research on the internet? How do you research in real life? How do you bring all of this stuff together? And then how, in the end, how do you make a story out of the sort of messy nature of reality? And so that was really required, and I wanted to sort of kick that into high gear, because I felt that we had this great opportunity to tell stories, and really add to this sort of the again, Digital Eclipse was really evolving the retro collection with every release, and so it was like, well, how do I not just replicate what had already been done, but how do we carry that ball even further? And this has sort of led us down this path now, to where we're calling them interactive documentaries, and we really truly believe it's like the sort of the video game equivalent of a documentary film. And I'm doing a lot of the things now that I was really passionate about, on the journalism side, which is I loved writing about old games. I loved it when I would have interviews with, sometimes people from Nintendo, and I was like, okay, we want you to talk about this brand new game for the Wii. And I'm like, I'm sitting in front of the guy who did pixel art for Donkey Kong Jr. I'm sitting in front of the guy who directed Super Mario Brothers 2, and it's like, very few people have ever gotten to ask them questions about some of that. I mean, I remember Super Mario Brothers 2, specifically was I ended up putting up a story, from Kensuke Tanabe, who I was supposed to be there talking about Donkey Kong Country Returns, and we did, and I ran a full Donkey Kong Country Returns story, but I was also just like, okay, so were this vegetables? How did this all happen? You got to tell me, because nobody's ever asked for. So to get to do that now, to bring people into our studio and sit down with them and interview them, and just get to just talk about, there's no there's no other pressure to talk about anything else, and just go as deep as possible into these stories that nobody has ever told before, in many cases, is very exciting. That's really the best part of the job, is being able to do that now.
I was going to say, you need to be asking the questions that nobody's asked before to make this interactive documentary as unique as possible. And I guess that's one of the difficulties of doing your role, right? Is sourcing this material, talking with people, and packaging it up like nobody's ever done before. So what are the difficulties there of producing, stuff like this?
Well, I mean, every project brings with it its own challenges, and then its own things that are totally taken care of. So really it's kind of about like designing every project around the information that we have or that we could conceivably get. So to take like the making of Karateka as an example, we were extremely lucky in that respect because Jordan Mechner, who created Karateka and then went on to create Prince of Persia, documented absolutely everything that he was doing and then saved all that documentation. He I really believe there's even more to the story than we were really able to talk about. And if you go to Jordan's, he did an autobiographical graphic novel that's about his life and the life of his father and grandfather. Replay. It's like his grandfather, who escaped the Nazis, was a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote a whole autobiography. He wrote down everything that had happened, to him. And Jordan was very aware that this was going on. And at the time, Jordan wouldn't have said, "Well, that was an inspiration for me to start doing a daily journal." But I think in retrospect, you can look back and say there was probably some influence there. But Jordan, when he started, right before he started with, creating Karateka as a college student, he started doing a daily journal, and he wrote down everything he did that day, or at least got some kind of entry down for like what did he do that day. And he did all of his designing on paper, and he dated all the design documents, have little dates on them. And then he had his floppy disks, Jason Scott, Tony Diaz, guys at the Internet Archive had rescued the contents of those floppy disks that could be rescued. And so when I looked at this project and I realized, like, oh my God, we've got dates. You know what I mean? On everything that happened in these journals. We've got dates on the design documents. We've got the contents of the floppy disks, and we can actually match all this stuff up, because typically in a retro collection, it's like, here's a gallery of design documents, here's a gallery of screenshots, here's a gallery of like prototype versions of the game. But it's like all these prototypes of the game that we have, I know the date that he finished these. So it really just led inevitably to this conclusion of we don't separate all this stuff out and have it sort of in an chronological sort of way. We actually bring it all together and put it on a timeline that shows you the date that all this stuff is happening. And you bring that stuff together in that way, and suddenly it all makes so much more sense, when you connect it all in that way. And you see that, well, this happened after this. And so Jordan doing all that work and us having access to all of that kind of stuff on Karateka was the inspiration for kind of everything that followed, because then so we were working on Karateka, and then we got the opportunity. We were not yet had not yet been acquired by Atari. We were still independent from it, but Atari wanted us to do something different for their upcoming 50th anniversary. But it had to be done very quickly, and it couldn't. The nice thing here is, typically, in the past, like working with publishers, we would articulate to them, like, we would love to do like something, that really goes deep into the history. But when you start talking about that sort of stuff, it for publishers, it sounds expensive, and it sounds like it's going to take too much time. And they're looking at these games, and they were kind of thinking like, well, we've got these old games, like, let's just get them out onto the market and make a little bit of money and be done with it, And so we're trying within those constraints to do as much as we can, but ultimately it's like, let's just do it the old way. So, but Atari really needed something that was totally out of the box, because they'd already released simple collections of Atari games. And in fact, we're already available on the same platforms we were going to be releasing this on. So they needed a pitch that was like, what are we going to do to celebrate the 50th anniversary? So we looked at the work we were doing with Karateka and said, let's do that for Atari. And so then the idea of the chronological timelines was now set in stone. And then, kind of getting back to what is the difficulty, Then the challenge is, how do we fill that? Because with Jordan, we already knew we had the material, so that material informed how we built it. And then with Atari 50, the structure was there, but we needed to figure out how we were going to fill that in. So then it was kind of a full court press from everybody to like, well, what do we do? How do we create this interactive timeline? And what do we need to go out and get, to have it in there? But it was great because it was, if you look at it, I mean, it's a whole bunch of different things, but I think it all works. It all works as this sort of like multimedia mix of, now you're looking at an ad scanned out of Atari Age magazine. Now you're looking at a 3D box of a replica of a game. Now you're playing a game. Now you're watching a brand new interview that we shot. Now you're watching archival footage. Now you're watching a TV commercial.
It keeps
and it's like
it's not. Yeah, it's like
yeah. And the nice thing is, it's all very disparate. You know what I mean? It's not. You could have like one TV commercial in there, and it's okay because you're sort of putting it in the proper context. It's not like just floating out there in the ether as like some weird bit of content that sort of got shoved into a menu somewhere. Because it's placed where it needs to be. Because there's a little bit of text explaining what it is. I mean, that was something else too. I was like, we want to show the thumbnail and the text, on the timeline. So there was a big design challenge by people who are a lot smarter than me about this sort of thing. Of like, how do you show that on screen? How do you show like the timeline and a thumbnail, and you've got all the text on the screen, so you don't have to click into it to read a caption on the picture? It's like the text has to be there because you're scrolling through. You have to see what the text is. Where do you fit that in? How do you fit that in every language? Because it fits in English, but what about German?
It's the museum of the future.
Yeah, right. It's like, how do you do all that kind of stuff? So all of that was like, it was a big interdisciplinary thing that engineering and art and design all had to kind of be involved in. And now we've kind of got this template that we feel really good about. So again, after Atari 50 came out and people, vibed with what we were doing, we were able to take, the sort of the prototypical version of Karateka and then take the data out of that and then put that into the template that we'd already kind of established with Atari 50. And then the Lamasoft, the Jeff Minter story following on after that. And calling that the Gold Master series. The idea of it, being like this series of, important moments in video game history, whether it's one game like Karateka, one guy like Jeff Minter, and all the kind of stuff that he did, and going on into the future could be, just as long as it's like an interesting story that all ties together, we can tell it in that way, and we take that base of the technology and the design and continue to improve that and add to it, with each release. But it's like, what we add in there and what we have in there is all going to be informed by what game, what person, what franchise are we looking at that point.
Sure,
and so there might be features in Making of Karateka that aren't in Jeff Minter, and there might be Jeff Minter features that aren't, in things down the line, because it's like, what makes sense for this story and this project.
So they're unique to each you've got your series, but each thing is individual and unique to the creators as well. And we had
exactly.
We had Jordan on last week, and we were talking about replay, and it's quite nice actually because we've gone full circle, because he mentioned you guys and the interview, and now you've mentioned him. So in each other's podcasts, you've got your own mentions, which is really nice. But we found it really interesting to talk to Jordan about how he was getting captures of his karate instructor, and then his dad wearing the same karate uniform to get up onto the ledges and things like that. And when you get all this footage, for someone like you who from listening to you talk for the first time on this podcast, you can see your passion for video gaming, you can see how much you enjoy documenting and getting these facts. To get all these floppy disks and all these notes and everything dated, that must have been like 20 Christmases coming all at once for you. You've got all this information. It's there. That's like you were creating a video game. You're like a historian in this sense, and just, to get all these things on your plate there, it must have just been like the world's best jigsaw puzzle, the greatest Rubik's Cube ever, that you can just sit and just slowly work on and create these amazing educational games that we've been talking about in these series.
You are absolutely correct. I mean, I remember the one of the big ones was actually with Cowabunga Collection, where it's like I woke
want
up
to talk about this. Yeah, we're big
I woke up
fans
to
of this,
an email, from our producer at Konami with a zip file in it, and it's like opening up that zip file. It was like Christmas because I opened this massive zip file, and it's all in folders and stuff like that. But it's all in folders based on. Because all this stuff, all these design documents for the Turtles games, which again were some of my favorite games on the NES, they were all they were sort of in order and sort of not in order. They were sort of organized into folders based on the physical folders that they had been in the Konami archives. And again, these things, as far as I know, up until we had done this collection, they only existed as like a piece of paper in a building in Tokyo. So these things were one earthquake, tsunami, volcanic eruption, the earth opening up and swallowing them all, away from being gone forever. And so it's wonderful to be able to preserve that and get all that out to people. But yeah, to start looking at it, I mean, you open up like one of these design documents and it's full of early level designs that I look at that, I'm like, oh, I know what game this is from. And you see the original concept, you see the stuff they're cutting out, you see little illustrations the designers have done of turtles and how they're going to react to various things, and it's amazing. Then you look and there's like 800 more pages of this, to sort through, and suddenly, I mean, it was months of my life. It was months of my life, going through all those things.
With like string going from like picture to picture, like you see on like these crime movies and stuff. They've got like a big wall, and you've got like I've got Splinter there, and I've got a turtle there, and then I've got this there. Like, what does it all mean? Like, how do I join it all together?
I wish it was something cool like that. It was probably more like me sort of staring at my folders on my computer and going like,
That's the same thing. It's basically the equivalent, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean that was amazing, and then I mean, well, the thing with Jordan stuff too is that we had all this stuff, but there was just the more you looked, it was like layers of an onion. There was more and more and more because there were so many floppy disks, and then it was like, well, I can't read this file. Is there some way I could read this file? And there was a floppy disk with a it was called Earth. And nobody had really looked at this. And then when I was reading the journals, I realized that this was an early demo that Jordan had worked on. And I took that and I sent it to Mike Micah, our studio head. And I'm like, so this is an Apple II demo. Do you think you get this running? And he ended up spending a lot of time trying to get it running and was able to get this this program running. Very simple program. And you see the results of this in the game. It's just like a cursor revolving around planet Earth. But he got that running, and we were able to show that to Jordan for the first time in like 40 years. And I mean, it's possible we could have done more. Like every one of these projects has a schedule, and I have to finish up a lot of my stuff like very early, because I've got to have all that research done. Well, first of all, I mean, I have to do so much of it in almost like in pre-production, because I have to go in and say, well, this is the story we're going to tell, and these are the features, because everything is downstream of that initial research, and these are the features we're going to need. These are the games we're going to need to include, and that means these are the emulators that we're going to need to include, and that means this and that and the other. And so a lot of the text has to get written early, because it has to get it all has to get localized and implemented, and the videos have to be done very early because they have to be subtitled, and then the subtitles have to get localized. And so when you start counting backwards from like when all this needs to be done, a lot of that stuff has to be done very early. And then of course, always towards the end of the project, you'll find something else, and it's like, this has to get in. A great example of that, and we did find this early, but in Atari 50, there's this incredible video of that student journalists had shot at the University of Berkeley, and they right after Pong and the Magnavox Odyssey came out, like, and those were the only, those in computer space were the only video game products, available anywhere. They were like, oh, this is interesting. Let's do our student final project about these companies here in Silicon Valley that are making games with computers and trying to sell them to people. And so they went down to Syzygy, which was what Atari was called at the time, and they interviewed a very young Nolan Bushnell about Pong and about his dreams of creating an industry around video games. And it was staggering that this footage existed. You know, it was the video footage of the very, very beginnings of the video game industry. And now you could take this, and the guys at Atari Museum had this footage, and they just put it on the internet. But we can't just put it in the game. Like, that's not how that works. Like, we have to get legal clearance. So we actually had to track down, and we did the legal research to determine that for a work of authorship that has multiple credited authors, if any one of those authors says, hey, yeah, it's okay to reproduce this, then you're okay. You have a non-exclusive permission to reproduce the work.
Okay.
And so, of the 4 students that had created this project, we were able to track down one of them. And the great part is, the wonderful thing is that this guy was now working as an entertainment lawyer. So, because the thing is, if he had been doing other professions, the thing is, sometimes you go to people and you're like, hey, like, we want to reproduce this in our interactive documentary video game, and they will think that you are trying to screw them. That you know, you give them a contract and they see this multi-page contract. Oh no, like, I'm signing my life away. I'm signing away the rights to my work. There's something in it. I gotta go get a lawyer. Now I gotta pay a lawyer. How am I gonna pay a lawyer? You know, it's like these things will absolutely happen. And we're just trying to just get permission to just reproduce something and not take any rights to it, you know, past that. So it was so lucky that we ended up with the guy ended up being an entertainment lawyer who was just like, oh yeah, sure. It's like, oh yeah, give me your contract. Okay, here's your red line contract. And it's
Signed
like because he sees it and he's like, yeah, okay, fine. You're clearly all you're trying to do is just show this old video. You know, I can sign this, no problem. And so that was, you know, an incredible stroke of luck, but it happened we got the signature and the permission so late that the game had already gone into submission. So that video had to be added in a day one patch. And this always happens with us where, like, you know, the funny thing is the things that we make, you know, we create things that people still don't necessarily know what it is that we're doing, and so we're like, oh, it's, you know, a bunch of, they look at it and they're like, oh, it's a bunch of old games, and then it's like 7 gigs, and they're just like, how is this 7 gigs? And it's like, it's my fault, sorry, because we've got like hours, you know, of video content, but we added that in a sort of a big day one patch. But we had to do it. We you know, it's like it was extra work, but that video was so mind-blowingly cool that we had to get that in there. And so that was just like an example of, like, we will absolutely add major stuff at the last minute because we need it. You got to have it in there. If it comes together at the last second, we'll do everything we can to put it in.
Are you finding that with Rita's Rewind? I know that it's coming towards the end of the year, but are you still working on that, or is it pretty much finished now?
Yeah, it's sort of the final push to get it all done at this point. Yeah.
Nice. How's producing that bit? Has it been easy to jump into archives for that, or challenging?
That is not a classic game, you know, compilation or interactive documentary. That's a brand new game. So that's something that I'm not as involved. The editorial team, because there are 2 of us, and actually Dan Amrick is sitting right next to me. He's waving at the podcast, and so he's actually been deeply involved in that one, writing all of the you know, the lines of dialogue and shaping the story and stuff like that. Because the story for games like this, it comes together in an interesting way, and I think you can look at other projects and see how it's like game designers are coming up with interesting game ideas. You've got narrative writers writing story, and then it's like, and then everybody's kind of getting together and be like, well, how does this all gel? Like, how do it's like, how do we through the narrative, express what's going on in the game itself and make it, so it all kind of dovetails, and it's all kind of happening. I'm witnessing it all happen. I'm reading and editing lines and things like that, but generally Dan has been leading the story efforts in that respect. Yeah.
As a diehard Power Rangers fan from when I was about 6 years old, seeing the fact that you guys are creating a new game for such a popular series from my childhood is phenomenal. And even though this isn't like the educational package like some of the other ones that you've been doing, where you're kind of like the working with Jordan Mechner to kind of create a way of cementing the history of video gaming, you are kind of continuing that work in a different branch by having a new game in such a long-standing series. Like, there were going to be so many people who maybe didn't watch the original Bandai series and stuff that I did as a kid, or didn't have the figurines that the head spun round and all those kind of things. They're just coming to Power Rangers for the first time, and you're giving them a way of going, okay, so there's this whole world with these amazing kids from Angel Grove who become Power Rangers, and they fight the putties and Rita and everything, and they're coming into your world, into that world through you guys, and then they can go back and say, okay, yeah, well, there's a movie here, and there's this original movie with Ivan Ooze, and oh wow, there's all this stuff. So while you're not kind of making the database, as it were, you're furthering people's understanding of what Power Rangers is and getting a whole new audience for that. And that must be really special to be working on games like that, where you can get a whole, you must know that there's going to be parents sitting down there with children going, oh, we used to watch Power Rangers when we were kids. And the same with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as well. It's like you've got the nostalgia element from older gamers who can then look and see younger gamers enjoying the same thing. And I know Brandon's a new father, so like in about, well, I'm hoping you can start rolling off young, and I'm hoping like age 5 he's going to be sitting down playing Rita's Rewind and asking, why are you a Power Ranger, Daddy? And you'll be like, well, like I am really, but I got to keep quiet about it, So it's just I really like the family aspect of furthering video game knowledge through games like that.
I had a fun, dad moment when because we were sitting watching, the Summer Game Fest, knowing that the game was going to be announced, and we watched the trailer, and my son was like, I can't wait to play this game. I'm like, you can play this game right now. It's on my computer.
Just don't tell anyone.
And I had him. I'm like, yeah, play this. Completely unfinished. I mean, there was geometry, there was like untextured, geometry in the level and stuff like that. But I'm like, yeah, play right now. What do you think? And I mean, he was having a blast because he's going around, beating up putties.
Coolest dad ever.
Did he have to sign an NDA as well?
You got to. I did not have him sign an. No, I didn't have him sign an NDA. So he could tell. So technically, he could tell all of his friends at summer camp.
Funny, he actually sent me a copy of it earlier today, so you might want to chat to him about that.
Yeah, well,
he's our next guest.
I hope he charged you some serious money for that.
He gave us 2 anime tapes. I'm going to sell them later.
Yes. So kind of going back to the your question. I mean, yeah, it's true. Again, from my position observing like what the team has been doing, I mean, it really is being done with a great deal of love and respect for the source material. Playing it does kind of make me want to go back and watch the show, So I think that yes, I think that will happen. I think that some people will, come to the series, come to the franchise through this door that we're opening. Yeah. So it's really exciting.
The last question for us is one that we do like asking here on the podcast, is kind of more towards the future. What are you working on? What's next in the pipeline? Are you going to be diving into more kind of interactive museums of developers or video games? What's coming up? if you
also the
can.
part- it's
So-
also the part where we like to ask
mean,
about key things that we can maybe use into news articles as well. So if you've got any little sneaky exclusives you can drop our way as well, please don't be afraid to tell us those. And Brandon, make sure you've got a pen and paper quickly just in case.
Right. I mean, right now, if you look, you can see so many of the different things that we're really passionate about. Actually, I mean, well, first of all, coming very soon, like tomorrow soon, is Volgar 2, sequel to Volgar the Viking, which was from 10 years ago, and so that's coming extremely soon. So that's an original game that we co-created and we're co-developed rather, and we're publishing. And you've got Reader's Rewind, which again it's a certainly throwback. And then beyond that, I mean, we are still I don't think we have anything announced. We don't have anything announced right now, that has that sort of editorial, kind of a bent to it. But you will absolutely see, more. The Gold Master series will continue. The interactive documentary style releases, and whether you call it a museum or a documentary or a timeline, things of that nature. I mean, we've had a lot going on here. We've had a lot going on here at the office, and so you will absolutely be seeing the fruits of that. Beyond
Great.
that, I don't know what else I could say, but we are absolutely just in a crazy period right now where a lot of projects are happening. So if you like what we're doing at Digital Eclipse, there is a lot coming up in a short span of time. So get ready.
Brilliant.
That's a tagline and a half. I'm looking forward to that.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, Chris, thank you for your time. It's super appreciated. Where can people follow you? Where can they hear your story, ask you questions, and kind of follow along with your releases?
Well, I'm not posting a whole lot, personally, that much anymore, but I'm still on, Twitter as, it's Kobunheat, Kobunheat is the Twitter handle. And then, I'm Kohler.bluesky.social over on Blue Sky if you want to search me over there. Try to balance it out. But and then, ChrisKohler.biz is my website if you want to learn more about me. I don't know. But, Digital Eclipse or Digital Eclipse Studios on all of the various social channels, find out what it is we're doing. DigitalEclipse.com. We try to update, every time we announce something. So, yeah, I mean, we're out there, and by out there I mean in here. I mean we're in here in this office, just cranking away on games. And occasionally they may let me out every now and again. But for now we're just making video games for you.
Brilliant. I appreciate your time, Chris. And maybe next year we'll have to hop on another episode.
Sounds good. I mean, honestly, again, at the pace we're going, if we do this again in a year, we'll have a lot more to talk about. So
beautiful.
Fantastic.